Thank you. Have a great session.
Great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. You know, if we were in real life, no, we are in real life, but if we were physically meeting, the people on the last day have a bad time slot. But because we're all home or somewhere for these virtual meetings, it really makes no difference. And it's my pleasure to begin the session on unions, politics, and labor law outside the United States, and also that the papers here were selected as best papers. So that's a compliment in itself to those presenting. As someone who has often had to read through papers, it's really a pleasure to identify great papers that just come to us, and we could give credit to the people who've written them and hear about their research. So without further ado, let me start. And in the order that is on the program, there's no objection. I'll start with Jana Karen Silverman from Penn State, who has written a paper about the effectiveness of union contestation in periods of political volatility and democratic decline, lessons from Brazil. Okay, Jana, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. And I don't know how much time we have, but I assume you'll.
Well, we have, you know, I should say, these sessions are an hour and we have 3 papers. So I guess if you aim for a little bit like 15 minutes, a bit more, that's fine.
Okay, great. So just let me know how I'm doing
Okay.
in terms of that. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a sense of my background before I start talking about the paper itself, I currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Global Workers' Rights at Penn State. But before coming to Penn State, I lived for many years in Brazil and worked directly with the labor movement. I was actually the country programs director of the Solidarity Center there of the AFL-CIO, and did my PhD in labor economics at the State University of Campinas in Brazil. So I'm kind of approaching this from both sort of a practitioner as well as an academic perspective, because a lot of what I'm talking about in the paper I actually kind of lived firsthand when I was living in Sao Paulo. So basically, the idea, the paper addresses the issue of what happened to the Brazilian labor movement over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years or so, because anyone who may be familiar with the Latin American labor movement on this call should probably know the Brazilian Union has always historically been one of the largest, most powerful, had these deep political linkages, especially with the Workers' Party governments that ruled the country from 2003, 2016. And then basically in a very short amount of time, kind of the Workers' Party government is forced out of power under some very dubious means, and a very anti-labor labor law reform is enacted, and the unions are not really able to mobilize a critical mass of the working class to defend this political and organizational project, and they're very much suffering as a result of that. So this paper is kind of an attempt to sort of address the question, how and why did that happen? Because again, it was a sort of very large surprise to all of us who follow the Latin American labor movement. And to kind of put that into context, so the Workers' Party government, led by Lula, who's a very well-known former union leader, then succeeded by Dilma Rousseff, who also was elected for 2 terms after Lula, because there's a constitutional mandate. You can only have 1 re-election in Brazil as president. These were governments that were extremely positive for individual workers, especially the workers sort of on the lowest tier of the economic and social ladder of Brazil. You had real increases in the minimum wage. You had a very expressive expansion of rights for domestic workers, for example, but you did not have, the unions themselves did not take advantage of this very positive political movement to rebuild or reconstruct a sort of more democratic labor relations system. And then, again, so they lose that opportunity, and then at the same time are not able to really connect this idea of union democracy, labor democracy, with the respect for democracy writ large, leading to this horrible situation of a constitutional coup, which leads then, to imprisonment of Lula in 2018 under very spurious corruption charges, which are then dropped. And now, as many people know, there's a very far right government in power under Jair Bolsonaro. And so the idea is, how did that basically happen? And kind of some of the hypotheses I'm working with is that there was when it came down to defending the PT project and building consensus against this anti-labor law reform, which passed after the impeachment in 2016. There was a lack of consensus, both political consensus and also consensus about strategy among the fragmented labor movement itself, that didn't allow for real unity of action. There was a lack of political education done by the labor movement itself when they had this sort of positive political movement to increase their membership, increase their links, organic links to the people, the workers that they represent. Then at the same time, they're also there's increased destructuring of the labor, even under the PT governments. You start seeing an increase of informality, deindustrialization. So again, this traditional working class that sort of forms the bulwark of the labor movement for many years in Brazil, like in many other countries, begins to weaken, and the unions don't have a sort of effective response of organizing these unorganized informal workers. And so that also weakens their sort of political links to this new working class that's surging. And then on top of that, you have this really strong, sort of cultural hegemonic idea of individualism, very linked to sort of the neoliberalism that was implemented back in the 80s and 90s, and which to a certain extent continued under PT governments, also linked to the rise of neo-Pentecostal evangelical churches, which have also very much sort of culturally changing the mentality of the working class to make them less attuned to unions and the sort of a message of collective action in favor of democracy and union democracy. So that's kind of the argument writ large. I start the paper off with, I'm not going to go into it in big detail because of time constraints, talking a little bit about sort of the historical trajectory of both the labor movement and Brazilian democracy. Basically to say that it's always Brazil, country very much shaped by the experience of slavery. This was the country that was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery in 1888. So you have sort of this permanent construction of a permanent underclass within the working class, mostly comprised of Afro-Brazilians, also very strong cleavages, gendered cleavages among the working class as well. And you have this labor movement that's created under this sort of this sort of left populist dictatorship in the 1930s and 40s, which has very strong links to the state. The state controlled its financing. The state has a lot of, unions that have state recognition get this automatic privilege of collectively bargaining for all workers in the determined sector without those workers actually having to be members of the union. So again, that kind of created a lot of benefits for unions to have this sort of very strong state linkages. And so as time goes on, you have the sort of democracy in Brazil kind of ebbs and flows. There's a military dictatorship from 1962 to 1985 that a sort of new kind of unionism is born in the early 80s to contest that dictatorship. Lula is the sort of primary figure that comes out of that movement. And then he forms the PT, the Workers' Party, which goes on to capture state power in 2002. And again, I go into sort of a little bit more in detail about how the Workers' Party government very much had a very pro-worker perspective. You had raised tens of millions of people out of poverty. Again, a lot of other affirmative action for Afro-Brazilians who are 53% of the population for the first time, for public universities, access to civil service jobs. So again, like really the same time, very, very important pro-worker, anti-poverty programs enacted, but at the same time, the way that they were enacted didn't necessarily politicize the working class. It was sort of like this idea of inclusion through consumption, mass consumption was the way that the PT government approached it. So you have this situation, and then the PT government bases its political coalition on three groups. One is sort of the internal bourgeoisie, the internal productive capital, which looks to this expansion of salaries, et cetera, and the power, the purchasing power of poor workers to be able to sell their products, car companies, clothing manufacturers, et cetera. Then you also have the poor working class themselves as a big base of support. And then you have the sort of more traditional working class, which are the three pillars of support for these PT governments. But then as we get into the second decade of the 21st century, Lula is replaced by his successor, Dilma Rousseff. And you have the economic crisis, which hits in 2008 in the United States, starts hitting Brazil around 2013, roughly around the same time where you have the second wave of the crisis hitting Europe. And Dilma takes these sort of more heterodox economic approaches. She starts lowering interest rates, and that starts really getting creating enemies within the sort of the capitalists, the domestic capitalists that were supporting her political project, and they kind of start moving away from that. And at the same time, the informal working class is always ideologically pushed and pulled, very much influenced by the middle class, which then the middle class then also pulls out of this PT project because they have not necessarily so much for economic reasons, but more for cultural reasons, because again, the middle class in Brazil very much used to having these social and cultural privileges like easy access to public universities, easy access to cheap domestic labor that the PT governments undermined to a certain extent. So you have this sort of political, cultural, and economic pressure starting to build against the PT governments, and the unions at the same time have to think about how do they mobilize against that. So I'm going to skip the next part of the paper. It goes into sort of a more detailed characterization of the Brazilian labor movement. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but basically to say that it is a very fragmented labor movement. Just to give a sense, in Brazil, there's over 12,000 unions right now registered by the Ministry of Labor. These are unions, what they call unions in Brazil would be what we would consider locals in the United States. They're not national level organizations, but in terms of the national level federations, which would be similar to the AFL-CIO, there are right now, I believe there's 13 that are registered, although there's only really 6 or 7 that have any kind of important political expression or institutional expression in the country. But even still, that's a lot of fragmentation, right? And they have a lot of ideological and political divergences. So anyway, all that to say that when it comes down to the moment where they are supposed to you have this crisis in the political crisis of the country coming to a head, you start having the union centrals that have a big divergences on whether reforms to the labor relations structure would be important or not. These divergences become more stark because before 2014, basically all the major labor confederations, even those that are not organically connected to the PT, did support the PT government, the PT candidates. That starts to crumble as the unions themselves feel these political pressures from other political allies outside of the sort of governing PT coalition. And so a major confederation, the second biggest confederation, Força Sindical, decides actively not to support the re-election of Dilma Rousseff in 2014, leaving the biggest confederation, the CUT, to kind of be sort of responsible for mobilizing the working class to support the project as this impeachment process gets closer and closer in 2015, 2016. But again, my main argument is that this, as much as there was sort of a valiant attempt by the CUT and some other social movements to defend this political project, there was contradictions because a good chunk of the labor movement wasn't supporting it. They for whatever reason at that time, I think nowadays they all say, oh, we regret that. But at the time they did support the impeachment process. So again, it was impossible for them to kind of construct this unity of action. And again, so as these attempts, and again, taking in consideration this backdrop of immense media pressure, criminalizing the PT, criminalizing the labor movement, calling them corrupt. There's this whole scandal. I don't want to say invented because there was a basis for it, but using very sort of questionable legal means to basically put major figures of the PT in prison, including Lula himself. So you have this, backdrop of media backdrop that's again, creates this hegemony, pushing people, working class people who may not be politically active to support this impeachment process. And then after the impeachment is successful, unfortunately, that sort of anti-PT and then also in a certain sense, anti-politics attitude continues within the working class. And again, putting into context, the vast majority of Brazilian workers who live in poor neighborhoods, the favelas, they call them, the main interactions they have with the state are through policing, military police actions, and clientelist vote seeking, in election periods. So the idea to go to the working class and say, oh, you need to come out to the streets to defend democracy in sort of this abstract sense doesn't really make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And then when the unions start saying 2 minutes, okay. And then when the unions start saying, oh, let's start when it comes to debating this anti-union labor law reform, which take away the main source of financing for unions, the union tax in 2017, many of these workers who are already in the informal sector and not officially represented by unions, again, don't have much motivation to actually go out to the streets and defend laws that do not effectively protect them in the first place. And then again, what I was mentioning in the beginning, you have again this very strong sort of ideological, cultural, political current, especially among younger people, saying this idea of you just have to pull yourself up to with your bootstraps, this idea of like everyone should be an entrepreneur, instead of seeking formal sector work with a contract, and so there's a very big increase in sort of this micro entrepreneurship in Brazil as sort of especially as the formal sector labor market begins to break apart starting in 2014. So again, it's this ideological pull that also really very much affects young people. Young workers, so these young workers are entering into the labor market as informal workers, as micro entrepreneurs, but they again don't have the union movement or sort of formal sector labor rights as a reference anymore. And so that's why they do not kind of take up this charge to come and defend democracy and defend labor democracy and union democracy as in detriment to their own futures, perhaps, So anyway, again, it's kind of there's no happy ending to the story, unfortunately, but just kind of in the conclusions, very, very quickly, sort of the suggestions I point towards is that, there is, obviously, I am an optimist. I do believe that there is a way for unions to work their way out of this crisis, but I think it's going to pass for them learning how and really coming up with new strategies to organize these informal workers, the gig economy workers. There's a lot of, delivery, the delivery app workers now, Uber drivers that are a big segment of the working class now in Brazil, just as they are in many other countries that are effectively right now outside of union representation. And then unions also need to kind of better combine, as Nancy Fraser puts it, the struggles for recognition with the struggles for redistribution. Unions really recognizing that there are differences, looking at these cleavages, gender cleavages, racial cleavages, age cleavages within the working class, and really taking the idea of, taking the ideas of building stronger affirmative action, workplace-based affirmative action policies, taking that more to heart and incorporating it more into their political organizing and strategies. So that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I wish we had more time. I'm going to take it just a chairman's prerogative to ask one question. Did you say, I did know that Brazil was the last country in the world to outlaw slavery, but did you say that 53% of Brazilians basically should be considered Afro-Brazilian?
Yeah, 53% according to them.
And is that, I did read once that when the Portuguese came into Brazil, that a lot of the indigenous people moved westwards, frankly, just westwards off the coast towards the Amazon. therefore, are the when you were talking about the favelas, if I pronounced that correctly, like in Sao Paulo and Rio, are they very heavily, could I be blunt, Afro-Brazilian?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's why, again, not to get into it in detail for time questions, but basically when slavery was abolished in 1888, and then these laws were immediately enacted, basically to effectively prevent many Afro, freed slaves from getting jobs in the formal sector economy, and also to get land. So they became this sort of permanent lumpen proletariat in the cities that then, didn't even have space for homes. So they go and build their own favelas, these poor neighborhoods. So, again, they're very, very overly represented among the lowest stratus of Brazilian society, whether you look at it socially, culturally, or economically.
Thank you. I have to say to the other people in the session that some of you may know I'm a law professor specializing in international labor law. And when I go to labor law conferences in South America, nearly everyone is white. I mean, it's very evident that the upper middle class and higher does not reflect the society as a whole. So that's why I was trying to follow up on that. Thank you.
Yeah,
well, maybe we'll have more time to come back to it, but let's move forward to make sure everybody has their time. And we have Sara Hungler, I guess, is presenting, and I don't know, I see initials, so you'll have to tell me what it stands for, the ELTE, Faculty of Law in Budapest, Hungary, who will be speaking about labor law reforms after the populist turn. Sara.
Thank you, and good afternoon, I think, for you there, or morning, I'm not really sure. Yeah, ELTE stands for 5. órán tudományegyetem, but you don't need to pronounce that well. So that's the biggest public university in Hungary. And actually, I have a double affiliation, and the other one is the Center of Social Sciences, which is important today only because the research I made, which is this paper is based on, was happening in the Center of Social Sciences, because that was a large EU-funded Horizon 2020 project with multiple universities involved, running for 5 years, obviously cut through by COVID, but anyway, we are finalized it now. And this is why I'm able to talk about today, like how the Orbán government in Hungary changed the landscape of social dialogue in the past 12 years. And actually, that's a very miserable topic to research, and there are many parallel moments with the Brazilian issues that I was very much surprised about Jana's presentation, and I will be able to point out many parallel issues. So to start off, the Orbán government had the second mandate starting in 2010, and actually just this May they got the fourth won the fourth run with the landscape victory, which is a very unfortunate miracle, and it was explained by political scientists by multiple reasons, like, for example, setting administrative prices for energy, or not sending weapons to Ukraine, and of course that the person of Viktor Orbán is perceived as a charismatic leader by many in Hungary. So we got the fourth term starting this May, but this is a very populist / autocratic regime. So actually my presentation and the paper itself could be labeled as the biased one, but I try to kept a very objective lens on my analysis. So they started off in 2010 after the 2008 economic crisis. So what they did with the labor reforms are actually not very surprising concerning all other governments' responsibilities after the big economic crisis. So the labor reforms had two major elements. One was the employment and social law part, and the other one was the collective labor law part. And with the individual employment law, they promoted flexibility, made a lot of deregulations, and curtailed social transfers altogether. And regarding the labor law, which is the presentation topic for today, although my paper covers both, that was about curtailing trade unions' right curtailing the right to strike very severely, actually. Actually, one of the biggest concepts of the new labor code coming into force in 2012 was that it altered the relation between statutory law, collective agreements, and individual contracts, which means that now employers in an individual contract can alter from the statutory law by all means. So if the employment dictates and what is happening in reality, that this is going to be the terms like that. As an individual, if you are not a member of the trade union, if you don't have collective agreement at the workplace, you must accept even detrimental conditions to your contract than given as a standard by the statutory law. And the third element of this reform was that the labor code promotes now alternative, meaning like less solid forms of workers' representation compared to trade unions. So from a regulatory aspect, I think that's nothing new in that, or it's not unique. But when we put it in the political discourse, we could see that this anti-pluralism in decision making is actually the key element of the labor law reforms concerning trade union rights, because as all autocratic regimes, the Orban one also believes that the sole and only valid voice is the one of the government, and anybody through any channels like civil organizations, trade unions, employers organizations are not allowed to form or join in this discussion, because that's the government who knows it all and knows it best. And also this discussion is centered around this illiberal way of democratic decision making, how Orban itself labors that, which includes that the welfare state per se should be abolished, because that's just misconception pursued by leftist liberals. And instead of that, the work first concept should be there, presented in all aspects of labor and employment rights, meaning that everybody should earn the social acknowledgement for being supported by social transfers, meaning that there's a big difference between deserving and undeserving people or poor, and there's a lot of reciprocity in being eligible for these merit-based social benefits, including unemployment aid or social aids or family benefits and so forth. And also that it's have a very strong discourse labeling Romas as the biggest and actually the only ethnic minority in Europe, as those who are the undeserving poor and who's like taking away, sucking away the benefits, the transfers from the deserving and white beneficiaries. So altogether, this political discourse needed a kind of explanation. So why Orban and this government has been doing this for like now more than 12 years. And my explanation actually lies in a political economic theory, which is linked to Nölke and Fliegenhardt. They argue that there's in Central Eastern Europe, there are dependent market economies, meaning that the governments are dependent very much on foreign investors in terms of running the economy and, of course, creating new jobs. And if you see these reforms through this lens of dependent market economies, you could see that this economic miracle, which actually is a huge support, or actually gaining much support for the government over the past 12 years, which resulted in a very quick recovery from the economic crisis, mostly because the employment ratio was really getting better and unemployment was shrinking. And actually it's like before the COVID, it was 3%, which is like really great. I mean, it's like the state socialist time with full employment. So this kind of economic reforms and economic boosters required a lot of foreign direct investment, especially in job creation. And tons of money through government subsidy was spent to foreign companies, especially German automotive companies. that created a sort of clientelism towards these investors. So what we could witness if we see like how regulatory mechanisms work, or how social dialogue is operationalized in the 12 years, we could see that for the favor or on the request, direct request of these big multinational companies, the government was willing to make very tailor-made and tailor-made alteration of the labor code just to serve these big companies. So giving a very good example, BMW came to establish a factory offering more than 6,000 jobs in Debrecen, which is the southeastern part of Hungary, and they explicitly said to the government that, yeah, we want to have working time banking not to last for 6 months or 12 months, but for 36 months. And that was a direct amend in 2 months in the labor code, which is devastating from some point of view. And actually, this is why I said it's gobsmacking that, like what Jana said about the Brazilian reforms, because this is very obvious how autocratic regimes can learn very quickly from each other, despite of the huge geographic distances. So as a result of these processes, especially those which were targeted to abolish national or tripartite level social dialogue, resulted in the absence of transparent democratic dialogue, and all the relevant social partners were technically muted and excluded from decision-making related to social and labor issues. Therefore, the national social dialogue system became completely dysfunctional. The formerly existed instruments for tripartite social dialogue was just abolished from one day to another. And which is a bit more scaring from a long-term perspective, that it has a strong spillover effect over the lower level of social dialogues. And also in the paper, I gave some statistics that whereas in 2008, I think, there were like more than 140 newly concluded collective agreements in 1 year. That number was 12 in 2018. So that was like 1/10 of the collective agreements were actually bargained and concluded at the end, because this kind of attitude, which is negating the existence of social partners, especially defaming trade unions, actually have its effects on local level bargaining as well. And especially in these big multinational corporations, which I forgot to say that according to Nurk and Fliegenhardt's theory, these big multinational companies accept as a return for the investment that there's going to be no social disturbances at workplace, there's going to be no strikes, there are going to be no unions who are wishing to increase salaries or wanting to have better working conditions. They give the jobs to people and they have to accept it as it is. So there's no place for bargaining, there's no place for negotiation. And overall, we could see that this 12 years was enough to completely destroy the social dialogue in Hungary. As you could see, or probably you know already, that in most post-socialist countries, trade unions are not too strong anyway. So they didn't really have good historical traditions which allowed them to overcome this period or fight back. Strike activity was always very low in Hungary, and there was no major disturbances in trade unions altogether. So these political and usually ideologically weak unions just gave in with almost no demonstrations or no strikes accompanied these reforms. And so to taking together the individual and collective labor law reforms, we can now see that labor law does not strengthen the right of people. They're not supporting them against the employers, and it's just serving the needs of these large, mostly multinational companies. And numerous protecting rules have been removed from the labor code. It became overly flexible in a sense. So this flexibility also killed the willingness of employers to bargain with trade unions, because as they can put anything in an individual contract, like a higher overtime or lesser pay rates, whatever, so they don't need the trade union support to unlock these instruments in the labor group, which was formerly linked to the collective agreements. And overall, the employees' vulnerability and powerlessness has just increased dramatically over these 12 years. And actually, I'm not really seeing that it's going to be any better in the coming 4 years. So like similar to Jana's conclusion, there's no happy ending to this story either. And actually, I hope there's no ending, because if there's no happiness, there's no ending. So I hope it's going to be somehow changed or thrown in the couple of decades. At least I can see it or witness it while I'm still alive. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sara, for that update. We'll come back in questions. I think we'll have some time. And our final speakers, and I don't know if you're both presenting, but if you are, okay.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, it's Chloe Fortin-Bergeron from the Université de Québec at 12, and Cassandra Bowkett from the University of Manchester. Institutional legacy and strategic capabilities, comparison of trade union responses in the UK and Canadian telecommunications industries. So I don't know who's going first.
Thank you. Chloe?
Yes, I'm going to share. Yes.
Yep.
Is that all right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to share. We got a presentation. I'm just going to share it.
Yeah, we went on to school and did slides, I'm afraid. So getting you back into the tyranny.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you to LERA for giving us the opportunity to present today. My colleague Cassandra, Bowkett, and me, Chloe Fortin-Bergeron, will present our initial ideas, paper ideas that we will be really interesting to get some feedback on. So we're looking at trade union representation in the communication sector, a sector which has been marked by multiple changes over the years. More specifically, we're looking at trade union strategies and response to this changing environment. We have carried out 33 interviews among local union representatives in 2 main communication companies in the UK and Canada. And our research question is, how do institutional configuration influence how trade unions experiment and use strategic capabilities to attain, maintain, and apply power resources? Cassie?
So I'll just cover this very briefly, but what we're really interested in, I think, probably are at a slightly different sort of analytical level in the past 2 presentations, but we're really interested in how unions can actually draw on particular types of power resources. So institutional, obviously, but also structural, so workers' positions within the production system, associational, power of mobilization of workers collectively, ideational, how they can influence how other actors think and the beliefs that they hold, and coalitional, so how they can build coalitions with other actors or groups. And we're really drawing quite heavily on the work of Refslund and Arnholt, where they talk about these different sources of power, but they also acknowledge the role of different analytical levels in sort of the process of accessing these power resources. And they also look at the role of kind of how unions are, what unions are seeking to do with them. Are they seeking to attain or build new power resources, to maintain existing power resources, or to apply them to particular contexts? Next slide, Chloe.
Yep.
And one of the questions that we're really interested in is interlinking these theories around sort of power resources and how unions are able to attain, maintain, or apply them by looking at sort of the work on strategic capabilities. So really we're drawing quite heavily on the work of Levesque and Murray, which talks about 4 strategic capabilities which enable unions to build or access power resources. And so here we're looking at framing, which is really about the capability to provide terms of reference, to create narratives, to justify new practices or mobilize members, or to change existing narratives and frames of reference at a union level. Capabilities relating to articulation, which is really moving between levels of action. So this is not only spatial, as discussed on the previous slide, in terms of analytical levels, but also in terms of time as well. So how do you move between past, present, and future? And then intermediation, which is the capability which talks about how you can reconcile opposing interests and demands. And this is really about how you stimulate collaboration in action. And learning, which is about the sort of learning and dissemination of knowledge, really looking at this notion of the learning organization and work on the organizational self at the level of the union.
Perfect. In terms of methodology, we conducted 17 interviews in the UK case and 16 interviews in the Quebec case, Quebec in Canada, with union representatives between 2014 and 2016. We also conducted a document analysis, particularly on the sector. The representatives interviewed were involved in different roles in the union, such as local representations, branch secretary, organizer. In terms of analysis, we conducted a thematic analysis using research insider, outsider pair approach. Some historical and sector context. We won't go in details, but if you have any questions, don't be shy to ask. So the communication sector have been marked by a high deregulation, which has opened to the competition among local providers. It also has been marked by major technological changes, which has brought a diversification in services. These have impacted the workplace. Mainly, union actors have noticed decreased demand for workforce and loss in membership, more performance pressure on individuals, increase in job monitoring, dissolution of the traditional workplace, workers being geographically dispersed in small businesses unit. So we can see that in terms of structural power resources, the two cases are quite similar. But in the Quebec case, have a much stronger institutional support for unions and collective bargaining than in the UK one. In terms of collective bargaining, in the case of Quebec, our interviews led us to know that the importance for local unions to develop and maintain technical skills in areas of collective bargaining and employment protection legislation. Unions have focused on maintaining and developing this institutional power in a context where technological changes in the sector have brought a significant transformation of members' work and an increase in performance pressure. To do this, local unions have relied heavily on training, whether offered by their affiliate union or by developing local training for the representative. In response to the diversity of expectation and needs of an increasingly diverse membership, often geographically dispersed, unions in the case of Quebec have sought to provide more discursive spaces for their members at the workplace level. Whether it's to better understand the issues experienced on the work floor, to be available to their members, or to encourage their involvement in the union, they have sought to develop and exploit these intra-union discursive spaces, such as local committees, assemblies during lunch hour, daytime meeting with departments in order to maintain their associational power. To do so, they rely mainly on their intermediation capacity. And in terms of coalition building, in response to the gradual disengagement of members at the local level, some unions have sought to broaden their action in order to become more involved in their communities. This involvement is leading them to expand their role and their agenda to reach out to the diverse interests of their members, while at the same time getting them involved in union activities for causes that goes beyond the workplace and the working conditions. The union maintains this coalitional power by involving union representatives in regional union structure and joint committees. And this involvement helps representatives articulating and framing regional issues into local issues. Cassie.
For the UK case, what we see in terms of collective bargaining is more movement between the workplace and the national level. So there's less institutional support, and so the union negotiates at a national level, firm level collective agreements. What's happening in terms, for example, with performance monitoring, the use of technology and increasing visibility of individual workers and work intensification, is that the union has had to work really hard to mobilize members at the workplace level in terms of resistance. So there's been building of frames around gaming the data in the system, ways to kind of avoid or mitigate managerial pressure to work harder. But they've also had to rely far more on their capacity to articulate between the workplace level and the national negotiators, who are able to use these sort of workplace resistances as a sort of lever to put pressure on managers to, in the case of monitoring, to reduce the amount of data that managers had access to the team level rather than the individual level, for example. And so what we see here then is, really the union using associational power to activate structural power by moving it from the workplace to the national level. Next slide, Chloe. Thank you. In terms of solidarity building, although both unions talk about kind of difficulties in mobilizing members at the workplace level, in the UK, where we see experiments around solidarity building happen more at the regional level, so at the level of the branch. And we saw some examples of interesting experiments around sort of equality, diversity, and inclusion, particularly with one branch building frames of action around race, particularly, but also some around gender. And these were built really using union discursive spaces, such as sort of the Black Workers Conference, which runs as part of the union conference, to try and develop union, like a frame around what inclusion and representation looks like for the union. And this frame was then applied at a regional level to the union's recruitment procedures and practices. So making sure they sent out diverse teams of union reps for recruitment activities that would represent the members that they were trying to recruit. And it also led the union to articulate and sort of move this frame from sort of the union level to the workplace by putting pressure on the firm in terms of HR practices and procedures. So really putting pressure on the firm to make sure that if their recruitment wasn't representative of the geographical location that they were hiring from, saying to them, well, where are you advertising these roles? Are you actually targeting the populations that you need to be targeting through the locations that you choose to advertise? Next slide, Chloe. And finally, in terms of coalition building, what we see in the UK is for particularly one of the branches, because this was the Welsh branch. And so what the union's done, because there's a lack of institutional support, it's been more difficult to negotiate with the government and policymakers at a national level. At branch level, so at sort of the devolved government level in the UK, the Welsh branch of the union has actually been very strategic and built coalitional power, using ideational power by aligning its kind of frame of reference with the Welsh government. And it's done so particularly around procurement policies linked to sort of broadband rollouts and digital inclusion, to try and encourage the government to sort of allocate contracts to good employers. So really building a frame around what good employment looks like, and that includes sort of unionized firms with high sort of employment terms and conditions. On top of that, the union is really trying to maintain this kind of capability. So it's developed training and workshops to try and encourage more union members to get involved in engaging with policymakers at that regional level. And so this really is drawing on capacities about framing, but also about intermediating, about aligning the union's views and union's approach to those of policymakers. Next slide. So this just gives a brief summary. Obviously, we can't go into as much detail in the presentation, so please ask lots of questions. But this kind of just gives a summary of the variation between the two cases in terms of the types of power that are being developed, the analytical level that both unions are working on, and so what they're trying to do, whether they're trying to sort of attain, maintain, or apply different power resources, and the strategic capabilities that they're using to do so. And sort of generally what we see is, the broad split as expected between institutional and structural power, which is very much driven by the institutional legacy in both countries. But we also see a lot of variation in terms of the strategic capabilities that both unions are using to develop and experiment to try and attain, maintain, and apply these various power resources. Next slide, Chloe. So just in conclusion, sort of our findings echo a lot of work, that already exists around the important role of national institutional configurations in terms of shaping the opportunities and constraints that unions face. But what we kind of add to these discussions are a focus on the types of power resources and how these national institutional configurations shape the types of power resources that the unions develop, the analytical level that they're operating at, and the strategic capabilities that they develop to do so. And what we're particularly doing is highlighting, the importance of institutional power in shaping how unions experiment and whether they are more or less focused on developing different kinds of power resources. So in the Canadian case, what we see is kind of a focus on attaining new dimensions of the existing power resources that they have, that really allow them to strengthen their institutional power, and how they can use associational, ideational, coalitional power to do that, so that they really focus on attaining and maintaining the existing power resources that they have. In the UK case, the union is more kind of focused on not only maintaining but extending the reach of the alternative types of power resources that they try to develop that enable them to strengthen the structural power that they have in sort of the small number of unionized firms in the sector, one of which is the one that we looked at. So that's really just drawing some very sort of high-level conclusions at the end, but we'd be really keen to hear any sort of feedback or thoughts that you all have about how we could really push the paper forward and develop this a bit further.
Thank you very much. Well, can I have a quick question? If you had to, let's say, on the basis of your paper, which you found out so far, so if you had to look at the Canadian unions, would you say in Quebec, here's one thing they're doing in the UK that I think could help in Canada? Could you draw a lesson like that?
That's a big question. We've been debating this a lot. I think there's like a lot of lessons that both unions could learn from each other. So the Canadian union's been really good at mobilizing, really working to mobilize members on the shop floor. How do we re-engage workers with the union? How do we re-engage members in sort of the democratic processes of the union, which the UK union has not been very good at. So then they acknowledge it's a huge problem. They're really concerned about it, but they haven't managed to recreate these spaces at the shop floor level that the Canadian union has. I mean, and I guess from the other perspective, Chloe, do you?
But it's also relied on the fact that most of the bargaining system and negotiation is taking place at the workplace level, so they really need to be strong at the workplace level. And I will probably say I was really surprised of from the UK case. All unions have been able to be involved in terms of hiring process, in terms of equity and diversity in the hiring process and the HR decision, because in Quebec we have joint committee, but it's more a consultative role that the union is playing, which kind of sometimes can constrain the impact the union can have on those HR decisions. So I was really, so maybe there's something there in the UK that the unions have been able to have more influence on HR decision that probably we can learn a little in terms of in Canada, I will say. Am I clear?
Yeah, you are, but I was thinking something else. This is trying to analogize it, that in some countries, besides the role of unions in bargaining, there is some device at workplace level where workers, in a sense, can consult with management. Now, it might be the union, and sometimes it's a works council.
Mhm.
And historically, the UK never had that. It was all through the union, and if you want to say more like adversarial bargaining, than if you want to say consultation and whatever. If for whatever reason unions are under pressure, having the fallback of this consultation mechanism is really helpful, because otherwise, which doesn't really show up in your study, but I can show it in the United States, otherwise the union just gets completely pushed out. It has nothing to fall back on.
Mhm.
So if I ever had to rewrite the US labor law system, either I would do an equivalent of works councils, or I would mandate some consultation based on information disclosure by the company,
Mhm.
separate from bargaining. But that is a total pipe dream, since it'll never happen, as you can imagine. But I really do think, because in the UK, you have to, Cassandra, tell me, but what I've said, because I spend a lot of time in the UK, as you say, as parts of the telecommunications business get hived off, well, then the union has to go in and organize again, and it's very difficult because it has nobody there, right? And the new company probably got the ability. The way the new company is going to be competitive, frankly, is because it's going to be cheaper and have cheaper labor. So it's going to fiercely resist unionizing.
Mhm.
And this is exactly what we find. So the bigger company, the old public sector firm, which is obviously now private, has good terms and conditions, is unionized. But the union, I mean, they're really, really proactive in trying to unionize these new competitor firms. But I mean, it's quite difficult. There's US firms, coming in that are very virulently anti-union, and it's very, very difficult. They're running like anti-union campaigns. So yeah, the study that we're looking at is probably not representative in some respects of the broader UK sector, in that it's got this legacy of being a unionized firm, and the union has a little bit more workplace support in terms of a legacy of engaging with management and
And the other thing you mentioned in your slides, it really concerns me. When factories leave, when they say, "Oh, we're going to make this product abroad," it's visible. But what interests me in certain jobs, and particularly in telecoms, when they offshore something, you don't actually see it, and so you don't get the reaction from the public. I mean, you're losing jobs, and I see that a lot, like an IT support. I should tell you, I have a place in London, and our BT, you're always getting India. Not that I'm against India, but they were jobs that were taken out of the UK. It's true for banks too, that things are being sent abroad. And that's very difficult, as we know, to organize.
Mhm.
Let me switch back to Hungary. I have a question about Hungary. The one thing that I see that is somewhat different than Brazil is, maybe it's not. In some ways, I see autocrats, besides as having to set up some sort of a villain, right? Whatever it is, and they're going to protect people against this villain. And a bit in Brazil, maybe it's these corrupt unions or whatever. But in Hungary, what strikes me is that Orban is really like being the defender of the Hungarian identity. So no immigrants, no Saras, nor this. Like he has this view that seems to appeal to the voters. I don't know if I'm right, Sarah. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're right. And actually, Orban was a fierce opponent of all kind of migration, especially through the 2015 crisis. But we have this villain, and this is inside of Hungary, and it's usually the Roma. Those who are undeserving, who are not getting the real job, who are living on aids, who are perpetually give birth to multiple children to maximize family benefits. So we have the internal enemy, but it's always a moving target. So now instead of Roma people who are actually also benefited from this economic upstream, and most of them have real jobs, so not only public free programs. Now we have the first enemy as the EU, who is always launching some kind of issues against Hungary, like the rule of law procedure, or discussing cutting of benefits because of corruption, for not joining the EU prosecution authorities and stuff like that. So we have always a different enemy or villain to picture for people, and it works perfectly.
I think that's why I'm going to try to be optimistic, like Jana said, since we're seeing those tendencies in so many countries where a charismatic, let's say, I don't know if Donald Trump is charismatic, but he really is good on television, authoritarian type brings along a lot of people. And once an authoritarian dismantles certain aspects of, I could put democratic dialogue, it's very difficult to to mobilize against that, because they've dismantled it. It's really difficult. I think this is going to be the challenge. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be the challenge of the next 10 years for many more countries if we go into a period of higher inflation, etc., in which many countries are seeing, because there'll be pressure on living costs, and that almost plays into the hands of an authoritarian. Well, our session's come to an end, and I'm glad we had a few more minutes to listen to these papers and sit down and read them more carefully now. And I always find it very helpful to have somebody present it and then read the paper, then vice versa, because you understand a little bit better what the paper was about. Well, thank you very, very much for your time, and I hope to see some of you next year in Detroit. Well, and I'll close this session now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.